in the night between the 4th and 5th of March, General Corbineau was detached from Fiume with the cavalry of General Lafayette for the purpose of occupying Reims, the possession of which was then too important to be left in the enemy's power. Reims was retaken by General Corbineau at 4 o'clock in the morning of the 5th. During that operation, Napoleon meditated another of no less importance. It was that of taking by surprise the passage of the Aisne. On the 5th, he moved his advance guard on Berry-au-Bac, where the road from Reims was to Laon crosses the Aisne by a bridge which had been recently constructed. The whole of the army proceeded thither along the crossroad. The bridge was carried by General Nansoudy's cavalry, and the enemy driven in disorder upon Corbigny. The Russian Colonel Gagarin was taken prisoner in that slight action. Napoleon remained that night at Berry-au-Bac. The passage of the Aisne having been effected, he resolved to dispatch scouts to Mézières, Verdun, and Metz. An order was sent by these emissaries to the garrisons of Ardennes and Lorraine to put themselves in movement for the purpose of barring the roads and assisting the operations of the army whose approach was announced. On the 6th of March, the army advanced towards Laon, but halted at Corbigny. The enemy's troops were, according to every report, advancing to meet us. They consisted of the Russian corps of Witzingerode, Vorontsov, and Sacken, and came forward alone in order to give time to the fatigued Prussian army to rally about Laon. The Russian army took up a position on the heights of Crayon. The mountain forms the commencement of a chain of hills, extending to our left between the course of the Aisne and the Laon road. The enemy, posted on the edge of that long road and narrow declivity, appeared inaccessible on the flank, and it was almost impossible to attack him in front. The obstacles were diminished in our eyes by our eagerness to strike the last blow, and our vanguard succeeded in establishing itself at Crayon, which was halfway up the declivity. Marshal Ney pushed on his troops as high as the farm of Ertupy, and the orderly officers Gourgaud and Caraman, having reconnoitered the defiles of the mountain, took possession of the most important. The troops drew near each other, and preparations were made for battle the next day. Napoleon passed the night at the village of Corbigny. The principal inhabitants of the neighboring villages hastened to the imperial headquarters to communicate information respecting the localities. A similar concourse of Frenchmen, full of zeal, crowded about Napoleon in every corridor. He was himself accustomed to put questions to those who came forward. He recognized that night in the mayor of Bayeux, Monsieur de Bussy, his old comrade in the regiment of Lafayette. That officer had emigrated, and since his return had a retired life on his patrimonial estate on the banks of the Aisne. Napoleon conferred the rank of colonel upon him, made him one of his aides-de-camp, and appointed him to serve as guide on the ground of Crayon. An emissary dispatched by Count Roederer from Strasbourg arrived the same night after passing through the departments of Lorraine and Champagne, which were occupied by the enemy. He confirmed the report that the general movement for retreating made by the armies of Schwarzenberg had been felt as far as the Rhine. He added that the inhabitants of the Vosges, encouraged by the flight of the Austrian baggage, had risen and occasioned enormous losses to the enemy on all the roads, that the peasants in the department of the Meuse near Bar-sur-Ornain had killed a Russian general and dispersed the regiment by which he was escorted, that the garrison of Verdun had pushed its allies as far as Saint-Mihiel, that of Metz had sent patrols as far as Nancy, that our places in Alsace were observed only by a few troops, that the French garrison of Metz sent out parties daily on the side of Spire, and finally, that the garrisons and inhabitants of that part of France were more than ever disposed to cooperate with Napoleon's projects. The name of the emissary was Wolfe. He made himself known as having been sergeant of artillery in the regiment in which Colonel Bussy and Napoleon himself had served. He received the decoration of the Legion of Honor and returned to Alsace with orders. On the 7th, at break of day, the Battle of Crayon commenced. Our troops successively ascended to the level, but the great difficulty was to establish themselves there. Marshal Ney and Marshal Victor fought at the head of the infantry. Marshal Victor was wounded. General Grouchy commanded the cavalry of the army, and General Nansouty, the cavalry of the guard. They were both wounded. General Belliard took the command of the cavalry. The fire of our artillery was directed by General Drouot, who succeeded at length in driving back the enemy's artillery. But the difficulty of marching up the acclivity was extreme. The ground was contested foot by the Russians, and it was impossible to accelerate their retreat by any movement on their flanks. The only trophies left to us of the victory of Crayon, which was contested a considerable part of the day, were the enemy's dead. The Russians were pursued as far as the high road from Soissons to Lyon. The junction of the road is called the Ange Gardien. From an inn which is there, the enemy made at that point a further resistance for some hours in order to give the Prussians time to evacuate Soissons and effect the junction. At night, the imperial headquarters were removed from the field of battle down into the valley of the Aisne, and the night was passed in the little village of Bray, in Lyonnais. Napoleon, after that sanguinary action, in all the dangers of which he had shared, still agitated by the uncertainty of battle, harassed with fatigue, and surrounded with wounded and dying men, found himself in one of those moments in which the disgusting horrors of war would satiate the most martial disposition. When the arrival of dispatches from Châtillon was announced, they were brought by Rumigny, one of the secretaries of his cabinet, and contained words of peace. Napoleon was never more inclined to listen to them. The Congress of Châtillon, which the military conferences of Lusigny had for some days suspended, had resumed its sittings, and the plenipotentiaries, the Allies, had displayed the rigor of their new instructions. The pretensions which had been just advanced by France at Lusigny were called a breach of the terms of the negotiations. The Duc de Vicenza was no longer allowed to enter into any discussion. He was required to subscribe to the condition of the ancient limits or to give in his counter-project, and they did not hesitate to declare that they would separate should France propose articles contrary to the base from which they were determined not to depart. Such was the substance of the dispatches received by Napoleon on the field of battle at Crayon. The Duc de Vicenza demanded definitive instruction on the counter-project which he was to give in. Napoleon had made up his mind that the conditions would be painful. He was resigned to the greatest sacrifices. The concessions for which he had prepared himself were immense, but he would not add to our humiliations out of promoting them by an act emanating from himself. "If I am to receive a whipping," said he, "it is not my business to expose myself willingly to it, and the very least I can do is to have it applied by violence." Rumigny was consequently not to take back the counter-project for which he had been sent, but to recollect the words which had just escaped Napoleon. Napoleon was, however, desirous that the discussion should be prolonged by his plenipotentiary at Châtillon in order to enable him to ascertain the real intention of the Allies with respect to the sacrifices we had to make. He apprehended, above all, the inconvenience of a precipitation which, to reach its end more speedily, might induce us to exceed the total of the sacrifices with which the enemy might be content. He was aware that the desire shown to come to a conclusion was so eager that he felt it his duty to restrain it until the last moment, within just bounds. That consideration prevailed over every other and dictated his answer. With respect to the danger he might incur by exposing himself to new hazards, he disdained to consider the extremities to which the resentment of his enemies and the indifference of his father-in-law might proceed. Rumigny took but a few hours to rest himself, and at daylight mounted his horse to return to Châtillon. After having dispatched him, Napoleon went to join the head of his columns. Our advance guard had passed the Ange Gardien, while on its march to Lyon, a detachment was sent to take possession of Soissons, and we effected our junction on that side with the Duc de Treviso, who had not crossed the Aisne. We had hoped to arrive at Lyon the same evening, but the road at 2 leagues from that town was contracted between morasses, of which the enemy took advantage to stop our march. Napoleon returned in person as far as Chavignon, a small village situated nearly halfway between Soissons and Lyon. He passed the night there and was joined by General Flao, who had arrived from Lusigny. Austria, being no longer in want of an armistice, had ceased to encourage that subordinate negotiation, and the commissioners of Lusigny had separated. That result had taken place since our departure from Troyes. It became necessary to think of forcing the next day the passage where the Grand Army had been stopped. That night, between the 8th and 9th, the first orderly officer, Gourgaud, put himself at the head of an enterprise intended to favor our attack. A crossroad turned on the left of the defile of the morasses. Gourgaud threw himself on that side with some chosen troops, and under cover of the darkness surprised the grand guard of the Allies. He spread alarm through the enemy's quarters and succeeded in effecting a complete diversion, during which the troops of Marshal Ney cleared the defile. Thus the French army arrived at the foot of the heights of Lyon. The corps of the Duc de Ragusa, which had crossed the Aisne by the bridge at Berry-au-Bac, halted for the night at Corbigny and debouched on Lyon by the Reims road. At the same time that the main body of the army arrived by the road to Soissons, our line was formed, and at 9 o'clock at night we were joined by the remainder of our troops, the Prince of the Muscova, the Duc de Ragusa, the Duc de Treviso, and the Imperial Guard occupied the positions assigned to them. Every preparation was made for the attack. The orders were issued, and the following morning at break of day, the battle was to commence.